The year 1828 began with a silence at Foxwood, a stillness that had less to do with the thick blanket of snow covering the park, and more to do with a slow, creeping decay. The silence was in the stones of the great house, in the draught that whispered under the library door, in the threadbare patches of the Aubusson carpets. It was a house holding its breath, waiting for a life that had long since departed. Frost etched delicate, funereal ferns across the tall windows of the morning room, obscuring a view of skeletal oaks, and the long, winding drive that saw few visitors. Inside, the cold was a physical presence. It clung to the damask curtains and settled deep into the bones of those who remained. For Miss Helena Cole, it was a constant companion, a reminder of her place in the world. She was a cousin of a distant sort, a dependent, a shadow in a house that belonged to others. Her life was measured in small, quiet duties, the mending of linens, the polishing of silver that was rarely used, the arrangement of hothouse flowers that seemed to mock the chill with their vibrant, temporary life. She possessed a quietness that was often mistaken for meekness. Her gowns were of plain grey or brown wool, altered from fashions 5 years out of date. Her dark hair was coiled simply at the nape of her neck. She did not speak unless spoken to, and she moved through the grand, cold rooms of Foxwood with a lightness that barely disturbed the dust. This was how she survived. This was the bargain she had made with her own pride for the sake of a roof over her head. The current mistress of Foxwood, Miss Hyacinth Bell, was another sort of cousin to the absent Duke of Velmore. She was his first cousin, entrusted with the estate's care, while he completed a long, sorrowful tour of the continent following his parents' deaths. Hyacinth despised the cold, the silence, and the country. She filled the house with what she believed to be life: brittle laughter, the scent of expensive French perfume, and a constant, nervous energy that exhausted everyone around her. That morning, Helena stood before the vast, empty fireplace in the gallery, a list in her hand. The vellum was cold to the touch. It was a list of requests from the tenants in the village. Simple things. A request for seed potatoes for the spring planting. A plea for repairs to the roof of the baker's cottage, where the rain now came in. A note from the vicar about the dwindling supply of firewood for the almshouse. Hyacinth swept into the room, a vision in sapphire blue silk that rustled with an aggressive cheerfulness. A small, shivering dog was tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Helena," she said, her voice bright and sharp. She did not look at Helena, but at her own reflection in a tarnished wall mirror. "Is that another of your dreary lists?" "It is from the tenants, Hyacinth," Helena said, her own voice low and steady. She did not raise it. She never raised it. "The baker's roof is in a dreadful state." Hyacinth sighed, a theatrical, put-upon sound. "Roofs, always roofs. Do they think money grows on the hedgerows? Tell them the Duke's funds are stretched thin. He is in Italy, you know, surrounded by art and warmth. He has no time for leaky roofs in damp little villages." She ran a hand over the silk of her gown. This was a shocking expense, but one must maintain standards. What would people say if the lady of Foxwood looked a pauper? "They would say she was being prudent," Helena murmured, almost to herself. Hyacinth's eyes, the colour of pale, hard forget-me-nots, finally met Helena's in the mirror. What was that? Nothing, cousin. I will tell them to wait. See that you do. Hyacinth turned from the mirror, her attention already elsewhere. Now I have news. The head gardener has finally given his notice. Old Mr. Albright. His lungs, you see. The damp. She said it with an air of inconvenience, as if the man's failing health were a personal affront. But it is for the best. He was entirely without imagination. All those dreary English roses. I shall want someone who can bring a little continental flair to the place. In the meantime, the man of business has sent someone to fill the position temporarily. He arrives today. Helena felt a small, cold knot tighten in her stomach. Mr. Albright had been at Foxwood for 40 years. He knew every stone, every root. He was part of the house, like the old oaks. He's a good man. He is an old man, Hyacinth corrected, her voice dismissive. This new man, Thorn, I believe his name is... He comes with a recommendation. Apparently he is skilled, though I am told he is a man of few words. You will show him the greenhouses and the kitchen garden. See that he understands I will not tolerate wilted lettuce. With that, she swept out of the room, the scent of her perfume lingering like a promise of spring that would never arrive. Helena stood alone in the gallery, the list still in her hand. She looked from the tenant's spidery handwriting to the frosted window panes. Seed potatoes, a dry roof, firewood, small, essential dignities. She folded the list and tucked it into the pocket of her gown. There was nothing she could do. Not today. Later that afternoon, a man stood at the kitchen entrance. He was not what Helena had expected. She had pictured someone like Mr. Albright, stooped and weathered. This man was tall, broad-shouldered, and stood with a stillness that was unnerving. He was dressed in plain, durable country clothes, but they fit him in a way that suggested a powerful frame beneath. His face was all sharp angles and shadows under the brim of a low, pulled hat. He held the hat in his hands now, revealing a head of thick, raven-black hair. When he looked at her, his eyes were the colour of a stormy sea, a startling, clear grey that seemed to see right through her careful composure. "Miss Cole?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth or inflection. "You must be Mr. Thorn," she replied, forcing her own voice to remain level. "I am to show you the grounds." He gave a short, sharp nod. Nothing more. As she led him out into the biting wind, she felt his presence behind her, like a pressure. He did not speak. He simply watched, his gaze sweeping over the neglected gardens, the cracked panes of the greenhouses, the overgrown paths. She pointed out the various sections. The rose garden, now a tangle of thorny canes. The kitchen garden, its beds fallow and hard with frost. The crumbling stone wall of the south terrace. She spoke of what was needed, her tone practical and devoid of complaint. Mr. Albright was hoping to mend this wall in the spring. The frost has been particularly harsh this year. "I see," Mr. Thorn said. The two words were clipped, final. She felt a flicker of irritation. His silence was not respectful. It was judgmental. Did he think this was her fault? She was as powerless as the wilting plants in the conservatory. She stopped and turned to face him, the wind whipping a stray strand of hair across her cheek. "The estate has not had the resources for many repairs of late, Mr. Thorn." He looked at her for a long moment, his sea-grey eyes unreadable. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "And yet you remain, Miss Cole." It was not a question, but a statement. It hung in the cold air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Why did she stay? The question was one she often asked herself in the dark hours before dawn. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because some small, foolish part of her felt a duty to this place, to the memory of the kind old Duke and Duchess who had offered her a home when she had none. "Foxwood is my home," she said, the words tasting of both pride and ashes. He nodded again, that same curt gesture. He looked away from her, toward the great grey house. "I will begin tomorrow," he said, and with that he turned and walked toward the small gardener's cottage at the edge of the woods, leaving her alone with the wind and the weight of his silent assessment. From the window of the gardener's cottage, Theodore, Duke of Velmore, watched her walk back to the house. Her slight figure, in its plain grey gown, was a lonely shape against the vast, winter-bleached landscape. Mr. Thorne. The name felt foreign on his own tongue, a rough garment he was unaccustomed to wearing. But it was necessary. For 6 months, he had been receiving reports from his man of business, vague and unsettling accounts of expenditures at Foxwood that did not align with the estate's needs. His cousin Hyacinth's letters were filled with effusive declarations of her careful stewardship, but the numbers told a different story. A story of excess, of funds diverted, of a slow bleeding. He had decided to see for himself, to arrive unannounced, not as the master, but as a servant, a gardener. It was the perfect vantage point. A gardener was everywhere and nowhere, a silent witness to the life of an estate. He could observe the grounds, the house, the tenants, and most importantly, his cousin, without the distorting lens of his title. He wanted to know the truth, not just of her accounting, but of her character. His first impression of Helena Cole had been exactly what he'd expected. A poor relation, timid, plain, forgettable. One of the grey sparrows that flitted about the edges of aristocratic life, entirely dependent on the charity of others. He had seen dozens like her in his life. Her little speech about Foxwood being her home had been predictable, the sort of sentimental declaration a dependent would make. He felt a familiar, weary cynicism settle over him. She was likely in league with Hyacinth, or at the very least, a willing beneficiary of her cousin's mismanagement, too timid to object, as long as her own comfort was assured. He turned from the window and surveyed the small cottage. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wood smoke and earth. A narrow bed, a simple table, 2 chairs. It was a world away from the gilded suites of Paris and Rome, a world away from the life he had been born to. Good. He needed this. He needed the grit and the cold to scour away the grief and lethargy that had clung to him since his parents' death. He had been adrift for too long. It was time to be anchored again. It was time to reclaim what was his. He unpacked a small, worn valise, laying out a few rough shirts, a whetstone for sharpening tools, and a small, leather-bound volume of Virgil's Georgics. His father had loved the book, a treatise on the cultivation of the land, on the rhythm of the seasons, on the deep satisfaction of labor. His father had believed a man's worth was tied to the soil he tended. Theodore ran a hand over the worn leather. He had come here to test his cousin's loyalty, to uncover a suspected fraud. But as he stood in the gathering dusk of the cold little cottage, he felt a deeper, unacknowledged purpose stirring within him. He had come here to see if anything of his father's Foxwood, the house that grew from the land and the people who worked it, still remained. He banked the small fire and lay down on the narrow bed, the unfamiliar quiet of the countryside pressing in on him. He was no longer the Duke of Velmoor. He was Thorn, the gardener, and his work would begin at dawn. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the slow, reluctant turning of the season. Thorn, as he was now known to all, was a tireless worker. He started before sunrise, his solitary figure moving through the grey dawn, and he often worked until dusk fell, the lantern from his cottage a lone point of light against the encroaching woods. He began with the greenhouses. The glass was clouded with grime, the heating pipes were cold, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. He spent the first week simply cleaning. He scrubbed the glass until it shone, letting in the pale winter sun. He cleared the choked pipes and coaxed the old boiler back to life, a slow, grudging warmth beginning to permeate the air. He was methodical, silent, his movements economical and precise. Helena saw him from the windows of the house. He never seemed to stop. While Hyacinth slept late and complained of boredom, the new gardener was a constant, steady presence. He was a man who seemed to belong to the earth. His hands, though clearly unused to such labour, quickly becoming calloused and stained with soil. She was tasked with bringing him his midday meal, a hunk of bread and cheese, and a flask of weak ale, a duty she performed with a quiet formality. She would find him in one of the greenhouses, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his dark hair damp with effort. He would stop his work, take the meal with a curt nod of thanks, and eat standing up, his gaze fixed on the task he had just left. Their conversations were brief, functional. "The soil in the west beds is poor," he stated one day, not looking at her. "It needs lime and manure." "There is no budget for lime," she replied, her voice flat. "And the stable boys have been selling the manure to a neighbouring farmer." He turned then, his sea-grey eyes fixing on her. He did not look surprised. He looked as though she had just confirmed something he already knew. "Who gave the order for that?" "Miss Bell," Helena said. "She said the estate had no need of it." Thorn wiped his hands on a piece of sacking. He said nothing more, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then he turned back to his work, his shoulders set in a hard line. Helena retreated, feeling as though she had been dismissed. The man was infuriating. His silence was a wall, his brief questions like stones thrown over it. And yet, she could not deny the changes he was already making. A fragile warmth now filled the main conservatory. The scent of damp earth was replacing the smell of decay. He had found a small cache of violet seeds in a forgotten tin, and had planted them in shallow pots. The first tiny green shoots were beginning to appear. A week later, she found him not in the greenhouses, but in the abandoned rose garden. He was systematically cutting back the dead wood, his shears moving with a brutal, satisfying precision. The thorny canes lay in great piles around him. It looked like destruction, but she knew it was the only way to encourage new growth. Mr. Albright always said, "You must be cruel to be kind with roses." she offered, setting his lunch on a stone bench. He paused, looking at the gnarled branch in his hand. He was right. He glanced at her. "You know a great deal about gardens, Miss Cole." "I spent much of my childhood in them," she said, surprised into a confession. "My father was a country vicar. Our garden was our larder and our world." A sudden, sharp memory of her father, his hands stained with earth just like thorns, pricked at her. She pushed it away. This was once the most beautiful rose garden in the county. The old Duchess, the Duke's mother. She designed it herself. Each variety was chosen for its scent. Thorne looked at the tangled mess around them. "It will be again." It was not a boast. It was a promise. The quiet certainty in his voice resonated within her, a strange echo of her own secret, hopeless wishes for this place. She found herself lingering. "The Duchess favoured the old damask roses," she continued, her voice softer. "She said they had the truest perfume. There was one, over by the wall, a Gloire de France. Its blooms were the colour of a blush." He followed her gaze to the crumbling south wall. "I will look for it." She left him then, a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the weak winter sun. It was the first time they had spoken of something other than budgets and decay. It was the first time she had felt seen by him, not as a dependent, but as someone who also knew and loved this place. From his vantage point, Theodore was assembling a portrait of Foxwood, piece by painful piece. He saw Hyacinth, his cousin, in all her casual cruelty. He watched her dismiss a housemaid for accidentally chipping a saucer. He saw her sell a stand of ancient oaks from the West Wood to a timber merchant, the money paid directly into her hand, never to be seen in the estate ledgers. Her laughter at the nightly card parties she hosted for her fawning neighbours grated on his nerves, a shrill counterpoint to the quiet dignity of the house she was draining dry. But the other portrait emerging was the one that confused and intrigued him. The portrait of Helena Cole. He saw things she never knew he saw. He saw her in the kitchens late at night, long after the other servants were abed, carefully darning a set of household linens, her fingers nimble and quick, her face etched with concentration in the flickering candlelight. He knew from the housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, a woman whose loyalty he trusted implicitly, and who had recognized him on his first day with a gasp and a sworn promise of silence, that Hyacinth had refused to order new linens. Helena was preserving what was left, stitch by quiet stitch. One afternoon, through the grimy window of the potting shed, he saw a small, ragged child from the village creeping up to the kitchen door. It was the baker's son. He watched as Helena emerged, looked around to ensure no one was watching, and then passed the boy a small bundle. It was her own serving of bread and cold meat from her midday meal. She knelt, spoke to the child in a low, gentle voice, and then sent him away with a quick, sad smile before disappearing back inside. She did not know he was there. She did not know anyone was watching. It was an act of pure, unrewarded kindness. It was not the act of a timid accomplice. It was the act of a woman with a spine of steel, forged in quiet integrity. His cynicism began to fray at the edges. This was not the grey sparrow he had first imagined. This was something else entirely. A woman who fought her battles in silence, with a needle and thread, and a piece of her own bread. He began to look for her. He found himself timing his work in the kitchen garden to coincide with the times she might pass by on her way to the village. He listened for the sound of her light footstep on the gravel path. The brief, formal exchanges over his midday meal became the anchor of his day. He started leaving small, anonymous gifts for her. He noticed the handle on her favorite trowel was loose. The next morning, she found it repaired. The wood sanded smooth, the metal tight. A stone on the path to the vicarage was treacherous and loose. The next day, it was set firm in the earth. He would watch from a distance as she discovered these small fixes, a flicker of surprise and confusion on her face. She never knew it was him. The anonymity of it was a strange pleasure. It was a way of caring for her without the weight of his title, without the complication of who he was. His hands, once soft and accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen or the reins of a thoroughbred, were now rough, calloused, and strong. He felt a satisfaction in the ache of his muscles at the end of the day, a clarity of mind he had not known in years. He was not just uncovering a betrayal. He was uncovering a part of himself he thought had been buried with his father. One evening, Mrs. Croft brought his dinner to the cottage. She was a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense air. "Your Grace," she began, her voice low, though they were quite alone. "Thorn," he corrected her, not for the first time. "Here, I am Thorn." She gave a small, exasperated sigh. "Mr. Thorn, you have been here a month. You have seen how things are. Miss Hyacinth, she is selling the silver, piece by piece, the Sheffield plate from your grandmother." Theodore felt a cold anger rise in him, but he tamped it down. "I know. I have the timber, the manure, and now the silver. Let her. Let her reveal the full measure of her character. I need the complete picture." "And what of Miss Helena?" Mrs. Croft asked, her gaze sharp. "You see her too, I hope." "I see her," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "She is a good soul. The best of them," the housekeeper said softly. "She holds this place together with nothing but her own goodness. It is not right, what she endures." "I know," he said again. He looked down at his hands, at the foreign lines of labor etched into his palms. He knew, and the knowledge was becoming a heavy burden. He had come to Foxwood seeking justice. He had not expected to find a quiet woman in a grey dress who was beginning to feel more like home than the grand, empty house itself. The snows of January melted into the damp chill of February, and February bled into the reluctant green of March. At Foxwood, the change was palpable, and it was entirely the work of the silent man in the gardener's cottage. The greenhouses, once tombs of decay, were now vibrant with life. Neat rows of seedlings, lettuce, kale, peas, pushed their way toward the clean glass. The scent of damp earth and new growth had chased out the smell of mildew. In the protected warmth of the conservatory, the violet cuttings Thorn had planted were now a carpet of deep purple, their sweet fragrance a defiant note of hope in the cold house. Helena found herself making excuses to visit the greenhouses. She would go to fetch herbs for the cook, or simply to stand for a moment in the humid, living air. She and Thorn spoke more now, though their conversations were still clipped, rooted in the practicalities of the garden. But a new layer was present, an unspoken understanding that flowed between them. He would save a particularly fine head of lettuce for her, leaving it on the stone bench with a silent nod. She, in turn, began bringing him a flask of hotter, stronger tea from her own small supply, a quiet acknowledgement of his hard labor. She learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, in the quick, economical movements of his hands. She saw the flash of anger in his eyes when he discovered another corner of the grounds sold off or neglected by Hyacinth's decree. She saw the deep, quiet satisfaction on his face as he surveyed a newly dug bed or a successfully grafted fruit tree. He was a man of profound stillness, yet he made the world around him grow. It was a contradiction that fascinated her. The other men of rank she had known, the fops and dandies who came to Hyacinth's card parties, were all nervous energy and loud opinions. Thorn was the opposite. He was a solid, reassuring presence, as rooted and dependable as the ancient oaks he so clearly respected. Her fear of him had long since evaporated, replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. Who was this man? He spoke with the clipped accent of a common labourer, yet he had quoted Virgil. His hands were calloused, yet they moved with an innate grace. And his eyes held a depth of intelligence and a weight of sorrow that did not belong to a simple gardener. One blustery afternoon, she sought refuge in the library. It was her sanctuary, the one room in the house Hyacinth never entered. The old Duke had been a great reader, and the scent of leather and paper was a comfort to her. She was trying to decipher a passage in a book on herbal remedies when she heard a quiet cough behind her. Thorn stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his boots clean. He looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of gilded book spines, and yet he also looked perfectly at home. "Forgive me, Miss Cole," he said, his voice low. "Mrs. Croft said I might find you here. I need the key to the old potting shed behind the east wall. The lock is rusted shut." "Of course." She rose and went to the large, ornate desk where the estate keys were kept. As she searched for the correct one on the heavy iron ring, a book on the desk caught his eye. It was the copy of Virgil's Georgics she had been reading earlier. "A fine choice," he said, his voice so close behind her she startled. She turned, the heavy key ring in her hand. "You read Latin, Mr. Thorn?" A flicker of something, annoyance, regret, crossed his face before it was shuttered again. "A little. A long time ago. My father was fond of it." "So was mine," she said softly. She held out the key. Their fingers brushed as he took it. A small shock, like static electricity, passed between them. It was nothing, a trick of the dry air, but her heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. He pulled his hand back as if burned. His gaze dropped to the key in his palm, then lifted to meet hers. For a moment, the mask was gone. In his sea-grey eyes, she saw not a gardener, but a man of deep, weary loneliness. A man who was hiding. The moment stretched. 1 second. 2. Then the mask was back. "Thank you, Miss Cole," he said, his voice once more flat and formal. He turned and was gone, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Helena stood with her hand still outstretched, her fingers tingling. Why had he looked at her like that? And why had the brief, accidental touch felt more significant than any conversation they had ever had? She sank back into the chair, the book of herbal remedies forgotten. The quiet man in the garden was becoming a puzzle she could not solve. And more than that, a presence she was beginning to need in a way that frightened her. Theodore stood outside the library door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He cursed himself for his carelessness. The Virgil, the mention of his father. For a single unguarded moment, he had forgotten who he was supposed to be. And she had seen it. He had seen the flicker of shock and dawning comprehension in her intelligent eyes. Their fingers touching. It had been like a lightning strike. He had spent weeks observing her, admiring her quiet strength, her hidden kindness. He had told himself it was an intellectual exercise, an appreciation of her character. He was a duke, and she was a penniless dependent. Their worlds were universes apart. But in that moment, in the hushed, book-scented air of the library, she had not been Miss Cole, the poor relation, and he had not been Thorne, the gardener. They had been a man and a woman, connected by a shared love for a dead poet, and a sudden electric awareness of each other. The feeling terrified him. It was a complication he had not foreseen and could not afford. His purpose here was clear: to gather evidence, to expose Hyacinth, to restore his estate. Falling for the quiet woman in the grey dress was not part of the plan. And yet, as he walked back toward the gardens, the cold weight of the iron key in his hand, he could not erase the image of her face, the way her eyes had widened, the soft vulnerability around her mouth. He was beginning to realize that his careful, detached observation had become something else entirely. He was no longer just a judge, assembling facts for a verdict. He was a participant. He was emotionally entangled. The knowledge settled in his chest, heavy and dangerous. He had come to Foxwood to test his cousin's loyalty. He had not expected to have his own heart put to the test. He worked with a furious energy for the rest of the day, attacking the overgrown ivy on the east wall as if it were a personal enemy. He needed the burn in his muscles, the sting of sweat in his eyes, to distract him from the turmoil within. But even as he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the library, to the scent of old paper, and to the shocking, simple intimacy of a briefly touched hand. The situation with Hyacinth, meanwhile, was escalating. Her spending had become more brazen, her disregard for the estate more pronounced. She had dismissed 2 of the oldest grooms from the stables, claiming they were too old to be of use, and had sold 2 of the Duke's own hunters to a neighbour. The money, Theodore knew, had gone to pay for a new carriage she had ordered from London. She was not just mismanaging Foxwood. She was dismantling it. His anger was a cold, steady flame. The time for observation was drawing to a close. Soon he would have to act. But the thought of the inevitable confrontation was now complicated by a new and pressing concern. What would happen to Helena? When he revealed himself, her world would be turned upside down. The fragile peace she had carved out for herself would be shattered. She would see him not as Thorne, the quiet man she shared secrets of the garden with, but as the Duke of Velmore, her distant, powerful kinsman, the master of her fate. The nascent trust between them would be destroyed by the revelation of his deception. The thought was a physical pain. He had lied to her. From the very first day, his entire presence was a lie. He had done it for a good reason, he told himself, for justice, for the preservation of his heritage. But he had deceived her all the same. He had watched her in her most private, vulnerable moments under false pretenses. He had earned her trust as one person, while being another entirely. That night, sleep would not come. He lay on his narrow cot, staring into the darkness, the sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of the wind in the pines, offering no comfort. He had set a trap for his cousin. He was beginning to fear he had caught himself in it as well. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. As spring finally asserted itself, painting the park in shades of tender green, the tension at Foxwood tightened like an overwound clock spring. Hyacinth, emboldened by the Duke's continued absence and the success of her small larcenies, made her most audacious move yet. She announced her intention to sell off the water meadows, a tract of land bordering the river that was essential for grazing the tenants' livestock. The price offered by a wealthy neighboring landowner was substantial, enough to fund a full season for her in London. The news spread through the village like a fever. It was a death sentence for the small farmers who depended on that common land. A deputation, led by the vicar, came to the great house. Hyacinth refused to see them. She sent Helena instead. Theodore, pruning the espaliered pear trees against the kitchen garden wall, watched the scene unfold. He saw Helena, her face pale but resolute, standing on the grand front steps, listening patiently to the desperate pleas of the tenants. He saw the vicar's strained face, the baker's clenched fists, the quiet despair in the eyes of the farmers. "I will speak to her," Helena promised them, her voice carrying on the crisp spring air. "I will make her understand." He watched her turn and go back into the house, her back straight, a small figure radiating a strength that belied her simple gown. He knew what this would cost her. He knew what Hyacinth's response would be. He gripped the handle of his pruning shears, the wood biting into his palm. His instinct was to intervene, to stride into the house and end this charade at once. But he waited. He had to see this through. He had to see what Helena would do. An hour later, a side door opened, and Helena emerged. She did not see him. She walked with her head down, her steps quick and unsteady, making for the sanctuary of the gardens. She reached the old stone bench in the rose garden, the same one where she had first told him about the Duchess's favourite flowers, and sank onto it, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She did not cry. He had learned that about her. She did not waste her energy on tears. She simply sat, her hands clenched in her lap, absorbing the blow. He waited a few minutes before approaching, giving her the dignity of a moment's privacy. He walked toward her, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the gravel path. She looked up, her eyes wide and shadowed. "She will not be moved," Helena said, her voice a hollow whisper. She called them greedy. She said I was ungrateful. She reminded me that I eat her bread and live under her roof. The humiliation was a raw wound in her voice. That I am nothing. Theodore's blood ran cold. He stopped in front of the bench and looked down at her. "You are not nothing." The words were rough, torn from him. They were more than he had meant to say. They were everything he had been thinking for weeks. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a devastating vulnerability, a crack in the brave facade. "To her I am. To the world I am." He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to tell her everything, to tell her that he saw her strength and her goodness and her quiet, fierce courage, that she was more real and more worthy than any of the glittering, empty people who populated his world. But he was Thorn, the gardener. His hands were stained with dirt. His place was to offer comfort in the only way he knew how. He turned without a word and walked to the most sheltered part of the rose garden, to the spot against the south wall where she had pointed out months ago. He had spent weeks tending the gnarled, ancient bush he found there, feeding the soil, protecting it from the last of the frosts. And his care had been rewarded. A single, perfect bud had opened that morning. A gloire de France. He carefully snipped the long stem, the thorns pricking his fingers. He walked back to the bench and held it out to her. It was a deep, luminous pink, the color of a blush, just as she had described it. Its fragrance was rich and sweet, a distillation of summer and hope. Helena stared at the rose, then up at his face. Her lips parted in a silent gasp. He had remembered. After all these months, in the midst of all his work, he had remembered her idle words about a long-dead duchess's favorite flower. She reached out and took it from him, her fingers brushing his. This time, neither of them pulled away. The warmth of her skin lingered on his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She lifted the rose to her face, closing her eyes and inhaling its scent. He stood watching her, his heart aching with a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a mix of fierce protectiveness, profound admiration, and a deep, tender longing. It was love. He was in love with Helena Cole. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. A real, definite lifting. Not quite a smile. The almost. But it was there. And she saw it. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him over the top of the rose. A question in their depths. "The meadows will not be sold, Miss Cole," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. "I promise you." Before she could ask how a simple gardener could make such a promise, he turned and walked away, leaving her with the impossible flower and the echo of his impossible words. He knew now what he had to do. The time for hiding was over. Helena sat on the bench for a long time, the rose held carefully in her hands. His promise echoed in her mind. The meadows will not be sold. How could he know that? How could he promise that? A wild, impossible thought began to take root in her mind. A thought so audacious she barely dared to give it shape. The way he stood, the authority in his voice, the flicker of something more than a gardener's knowledge in his eyes, the Virgil, the sudden, intense familiarity she had felt when their hands touched. Who was Mr. Thorn? She looked from the perfect rose to the broad, retreating back of the man who had given it to her, a man who had shown her more kindness and respect in 3 months than she had received in 10 years at Foxwood. A man who saw her. A slow, dawning realization began to spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She did not have the full picture, but the pieces were beginning to click into place. The absent Duke, the man of business sending a temporary gardener, a man who worked not for wages, but for the restoration of the land itself, a man who made promises he had no right to make. Her heart began to beat, a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the rose, a blush of colour against her grey gown. Perhaps hope was not a foolish thing after all. Perhaps, like this rose, it could bloom in the most unlikely of places. That evening, Theodore did not go to his cottage. He went instead to the estate office, a small, dusty room next to the library that Hyacinth never entered. He used the key he had taken from the library desk weeks before, the one for the old potting shed. It was, as he had suspected, the master key for all the secondary locks on the estate. The room was cold and smelled of stale paper. He lit a single candle, the flame throwing dancing shadows on the tall shelves of ledgers. It took him less than an hour to find what he was looking for. Tucked away behind a set of almanacs from the last century was a smaller, private account book. Hyacinth's book. He opened it on the desk. The candlelight fell on her elegant, looping handwriting. It was all there, every transaction. The sale of the timber, the manure, the hunters, the Sheffield plate. Dates, names, and sums. A meticulous record of her thievery. And on the final page, a new entry. A note on the agreed price for the water meadows, and a calculation of how much would be left for her after she paid a small portion to the estate account to allay suspicion. He stared at the page, the numbers blurring before his eyes. The cold anger was still there, but it was overlaid now with a profound sadness. This was his cousin, his father's niece. They had grown up together. He remembered a girl with bright ribbons in her hair, terrified of thunderstorms. What had happened to her? What fear or greed had twisted her into this? He closed the book. He had the proof. He had everything he needed. There was no satisfaction in it. Only a grim, weary sense of resolution. He sat in the dark for a long time, the ledger in his hands. He thought of Helena's face when he had given her the rose. He thought of her quiet courage, her unwavering integrity in the face of constant humiliation. He had come here to reclaim a house. He had found a woman who was the true heart of it. His deception had been necessary, but it had cost him. The cost would be her trust. He could only hope that what he had seen in her, she had also somehow seen in him. Not the Duke, not the gardener, but the man underneath. He made his decision. He would not wait for morning. He would end this tonight. He went to find Mrs. Croft. She was in the main kitchen, overseeing the last of the washing up. "It is time," he said, his voice low. The housekeeper looked at his face in the lamplight, at the grim set of his jaw. She nodded slowly. "What do you need, Your Grace?" "I need you to ask Miss Bell and Miss Cole to meet me in the Duke's study in half an hour. Tell them it is a matter of utmost urgency regarding the estate." "And you, sir?" she asked, her gaze taking in his rough gardener's clothes. He looked down at his stained hands, his worn boots. I have some preparations to make. He walked not to his cottage, but up the main servants' staircase to the west wing, to the ducal apartments that had been shuttered and draped in Holland cloth for 2 years. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, thick with the ghosts of the past. He moved through the familiar rooms, his footsteps echoing in the silence. In his dressing room, he opened a large wardrobe. His father's clothes still hung there, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. He took out a set of formal evening clothes. A coat of dark blue superfine wool, a waistcoat of embroidered silk, a cravat of the finest white linen. He washed away the grime of the day's labor from a basin of icy water. As he dressed, he felt as though he were putting on a suit of armor. The rough, honest comfort of Thorne's clothes fell away, replaced by the familiar, heavy weight of his title. The Duke of Velmore. He looked at his reflection in the tall, gilt-edged mirror. The man who stared back was a stranger. The face was his, but the eyes held a new gravity. The months of physical labor had hardened his frame, and the sun and wind had weathered his skin. He looked less like the pale, dissipated aristocrat who had left England 2 years ago, and more like his father, more like a man who belonged to the land. He tied the cravat with practiced ease. The transformation was complete. Thorne the gardener was gone. The Duke had come home. He picked up Hyacinth's ledger and walked out of the room, his footsteps firm and resolute on the polished floorboards, heading for the study where his 2 cousins were waiting. The Duke's study was a deeply masculine room, panelled in dark oak and dominated by a massive desk. A fire had been lit in the hearth, its flames casting a warm, flickering light on the globes, maps, and shelves of leather-bound books. It was a room that held the weight of generations of power. Hyacinth was pacing restlessly before the fire, her silk gown whispering with every agitated turn. "What can this possibly be about?" she demanded of the room at large. "To be summoned to this dreary room at this hour. It is absurd. Mrs. Croft was so mysterious." Helena stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt a cold dread mixed with a frantic, unnameable anticipation, an urgent matter regarding the estate. The words echoed in her mind, tangled up with Thorne's promise from that afternoon. The meadows will not be sold. She held the single rose, which she had tucked into the waistband of her gown. Its scent was a small, private comfort. The door opened. Both women turned. The man who stood in the doorway was not a servant. He was, in every line and every gesture, an aristocrat. Tall, commanding, dressed in immaculate evening clothes, his raven black hair perfectly arranged, his face set in a mask of cold, implacable authority. But it was his face. It was Thorne's face. Helena's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The impossible thought from the garden crashed into reality with the force of a physical blow. It was him. It had been him all along. Hyacinth stared, her mouth falling open. Her pacing ceased. For a moment, she looked utterly lost, her mind refusing to connect the man before her with the dirty gardener she had been ordering about for months. "Theodore?" she whispered, the name a thread of disbelief. Is that you?" He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet, final click. He did not look at Helena. His gaze was fixed on Hyacinth. "Cousin?" he said. His voice was not Thorn's rough rumble. It was the clear, cultured baritone of the Duke of Velmore. Cold, precise, devastating. "But what are you doing here?" Hyacinth stammered, her hands fluttering to her throat. "You are in Italy. Your letters." "My letters were sent by a courier. I have been in England for 3 months, he said, his voice level. I have been at Foxwood. The colour drained from Hyacinth's face. Understanding, and with it pure terror, dawned in her eyes. She looked at his immaculate clothes, then back at his face, the face she had last seen covered in dirt and sweat. The gardener. "Mr. Thorn, at your service," he said, with a slight, ironic inclination of his head that was more menacing than any threat. He walked to the great desk and placed the small leather-bound ledger on its polished surface. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. "I believe this is yours," he said. Hyacinth stared at the book as if it were a coiled snake. She knew what it was. Her carefully kept record. Her downfall. I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" He opened the book. "Let us review. February the 10th. Sale of oak timber from the West Wood, £200. March the 4th. Sale of 2 hunters from the stable, 300 guineas. March the 20th. 1 silver serving platter. Sheffield. Circa 1780. £50. He read the entries in a calm, dispassionate monotone, each word a hammer blow. Hyacinth sank into a chair, her bravado crumbling into dust. A choked sob escaped her. "Theodore, please." "Please what, Hyacinth?" he asked, his voice still quiet, yet ringing with the authority of a judge. "Please allow you to continue to sell my heritage piece by piece to fund your gowns and card parties. Please allow you to beggar my tenants and ruin the land my father and his father before him nurtured." "I needed the money," she cried, her voice rising to a desperate wail. "You have no idea how expensive it is to maintain this place, to maintain one's position." "I have a very clear idea," he said. "I also know the difference between maintenance and theft, between prudence and greed." His voice softened almost imperceptibly, a note of the weariness he had felt earlier creeping in. "I remember a girl who was afraid of thunderstorms, Hyacinth. I remember my father paying your father's debts again and again. I had hoped you were better than this." That small, unexpected flicker of personal history seemed to break her. The last of her defenses fell away. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with ragged sobs. It was not the crying of a thwarted villain. It was the desolate, hopeless weeping of a lost and frightened soul who had been caught in a trap of her own making. Helena watched, her own shock momentarily forgotten. She saw not the cruel taskmistress, but a woman broken by her own weakness. The triumph she should have felt was absent, replaced by a profound and painful pity. The Duke's victory was not satisfying. It was simply sad. He let her cry for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice firm but not unkind. "You will leave Foxwood in the morning. I have made arrangements for you to live with the dowager cousins in Bath. An allowance will be provided for you, sufficient for a quiet life. Your debts will be paid, but you will never have stewardship of anything belonging to this family again." He closed the ledger, It was over. Then he turned. He turned to Helena. She stood frozen by the door, the rose still clutched in her hand. He had not looked at her once, but she had felt his awareness of her in every line of his body. Now his full attention was on her, and she felt stripped bare, all her secret thoughts and feelings exposed. The cold mask of the Duke dissolved, replaced by something far more terrifying, the vulnerable, uncertain gaze of the man she had come to know as Thorn. "Helena," he said. Her name, spoken with a familiarity that made her heart ache. She could not speak. The deception was too vast, too total. The man who had shared her love for the garden, who had fixed her trowel and given her a rose, had been watching her, judging her all along. She felt a wave of humiliation, so intense it threatened to suffocate her. He took a step toward her. "I know what you must be thinking." "Do you?" She finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea?" "I lied to you," he said, his voice raw. "There is no excuse for it that does not sound self-serving. I came here for a purpose, and I could not risk revealing myself. But what I saw, what I learned, that was not a lie." He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was standing just before her. He was so close she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes, the tense line of his mouth. "I saw you," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming an intimate murmur meant only for her. "I saw you mending linens when you thought no one was looking. I saw you give your own food to a hungry child. I saw you stand up for the tenants when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I saw your courage and your integrity and your goodness. I came to Foxwood to find a thief. Instead, I found its heart." Tears she had refused to shed for Hyacinth's cruelty now welled in her eyes, blurring his face. They were tears of shock, of pain, of a fragile, burgeoning hope. "I was a gardener," she whispered, "and I was a duke. I thought I knew who I was. But you—" He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently touched the rose at her waist. "You showed me that a man is not his title. He is what he tends, what he values, what he is willing to fight for." He looked directly into her eyes, all pretense gone, his own heart laid bare. "I am asking you to stay at Foxwood, Helena, not as a dependent, not as my cousin." He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "But as its mistress, as my wife." The proposal hung in the air, as shocking and as beautiful as the rose she held. He was not commanding her. He was asking. He was offering her not a title or a fortune, but a partnership. He was offering her a home, not of charity, but of choice. She looked at the man before her. She saw the Duke, powerful and commanding. She saw Thorn, quiet and steadfast. And for the first time, she saw Theodore, a man as lonely and as lost as she had been. A man who had seen her, truly seen her, and had loved what he saw. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She did not know what the future held. The path would be difficult. There was much to forgive, much to understand. But as she looked into his earnest, hopeful eyes, she knew the answer. She gave a small, tremulous nod. And for the first time, Theodore, Duke of Velmore, truly smiled. Epilogue. 6 months later, the gardens of Foxwood were ablaze with the glory of late summer. The rose garden, under the joint direction of the Duke and his new Duchess, was a symphony of colour and scent. The Gloire de France, rescued and nurtured, bloomed profusely against the newly repaired south wall. The water meadows were lush and green, dotted with contented livestock. The house itself seemed to breathe again, its windows clean and shining, its rooms filled with light and air, and the sound of quiet, purposeful activity. One warm afternoon, Helena and Theodore walked along the gravel paths, their hands clasped. Helena was no longer in grey. She wore a simple gown of pale blue muslin that brought out the warmth in her eyes. A plain gold band sat on her finger. It felt more real, more precious than any diamond. Mrs. Croft had a letter from Bath, she said quietly. Theodore's hand tightened on hers. And? Hyacinth is settled. She is teaching piano to young ladies. The letter was apparently quite subdued. She asked after the gardens. Theodore was silent for a moment. The victory over his cousin had left a scar. It was a necessary amputation, but a part of his family had been lost all the same. The resolution was tinged with the bitterness of that loss. I hope she finds some peace in it. I think perhaps she will, Helena said. She understood the sadness in him, for she felt it too. Their happiness had been built on the foundation of another's failure. It was a sobering thought, a reminder that joy and sorrow were often inextricably entwined. He stopped and turned to her, his sea-grey eyes soft. Are you happy here, Helena? She looked at the house, at the blooming gardens, at the man beside her. She remembered the cold, silent creature she had been, moving through the shadows, praying not to be noticed. Now she stood in the sun, seen and known and loved. She had found not just a home, but a self she had never known she was allowed to be. I am more than happy, she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain joy. I am home. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound respect, a confirmation of the vow he had made, not just to love her, but to honor her. They had both been in hiding, in their own separate ways. He, from his grief and his title. She, from a world that had taught her she was worthless. Together, in the rich soil of Foxwood, they had found their way into the light. He smiled, the real, warm smile she had come to cherish. Good, he said, because I have a great many plans for the winter greenhouses, and I shall require your expert opinion. She laughed, a sound that was still new and wonderful to her. They turned and continued their walk, two figures moving through the golden afternoon light, their shadows long behind them. The house stood watching them, no longer holding its breath, but breathing a slow, contented sigh of life renewed. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.